Everyone. In today's episode, I'm going to get into the housing crisis for Australia. It's not a topic I particularly like discussing because it's actually quite sad what's going on, and it's actually quite awful what policies have been done by a lot of politicians. But I think it's a really important topic to discuss because together, I think if everyone understands what needs to happen and what needs to go on, we can probably get better results. One, probably by the way we actually vote and by the things we put our actual resources and time behind, and also just by the education we provide to everyone. So in today's episode, I'm going to discuss, first of all, what broke the housing market. Second of all, what is being done about it, and then finally, when the crisis will end and what kind of needs to happen for that to go on. So let's get into it. What really broke the housing market? Now, one of the things I think people undermine or don't actually look at is the average household size in Australia. Now, this is something that people don't think about, but over time, the average household size has gone down year after year after year, and it's gone down quite fast. Sure, our birth rate has slowed, but we've also had a lot of people coming in the country, and you'd think people would be living together because of the prices, but that's just not the truth. People have been literally going further and further and further in terms of becoming more individualistic, and the household size has gone down. So you can see just here, like in the graph, it's basically on almost free fall from the literally mid-80s to basically where we are today. And it's just continuing to go down. But anyway, that's where we're at. Look, another thing as well, just to describe that, is if you just look at your household size per city, you'll see, particularly Sydney and Melbourne, it is going down. And this is just in recent years, the last 20 or so. Brisbane as well, and Adelaide, the trend is kind of down. Darwin as well, Canberra. Look, Perth's probably an exception with that, and Hobart is slightly down, but not as much. But that's just from, the trends longer term. So you can see it's not kind of just one area. It's not only Sydney and Melbourne, but it's kind of the whole market, and that's just getting worse and worse and worse, especially with the amount of units we've got going up. There's a lot of one-bedroom units that single people live in as well. Another problem we have is the dwelling approvals versus population growth. So if we look here, here's a graph. This is just off the National Australian Bank here, and macro bonds. So probably the one that everyone needs to look at first is the bottom line there. So that kind of broken line in the middle is your equilibrium of supply and demand. So you can see for the most part in recent years, it's actually been above that or very close to above that. The only time it's really been below that is kind of in the COVID boom, in that COVID period when we actually had COVID, and that's due to the international students all leaving. But look at what's happened since then, and we're so undersupplied, it's not even funny. Like those dwelling approvals compared to population growth is just ridiculous. Like you cannot have that, and that's where I say everyone to go to your actual top graph. And mind you, when this says dwelling approvals to population growth, right, dwelling approvals don't necessarily mean just because that the population growth is above it all, dwelling approvals sit above it. That doesn't necessarily mean the right amount of dwellings have actually been produced, because if household size is shrinking, right, then you actually need more dwellings anyway with no population growth at all. So that's another thing, but it hasn't really been even doing anywhere near equilibrium for literally like 10-15 years properly for a sustained period of time. So that's another thing. Look, building costs aren't helping it at all either. So look at especially since COVID, so it was fairly flat for a couple of years before then, but like building costs, have gone up like 60 to 70% just in the preceding years of COVID. So it's actually becoming, the crazy thing is people can't afford homes, builders can't afford to build them, and financiers won't finance them because the credit rating of a lot of these people isn't sufficient to do so. So it's like a three-pronged approach. People can't afford it, builders can't afford to make profit on it, and lenders won't even do it either. So it's just getting worse and worse and worse with that. And then energy's gone up as well, which sure, the subsidies help, but a little bit, but you kind of band-aid fixing it. We need cheap, reliable energy, not just subsidies of energy, because that comes out of our tax dollars. So anyway, that's another thing there. Look, something about all of this that frustrates me is the biggest question I ask is what's being done about this? And I wish I could say a lot's being done, but the truth is a little is, but not a lot nationally. Now, to the credit of of some states and some politicians, some are trying, and I'll give them credit there, because I'll be honest, as a politician, it cannot be easy making a decision that's not going to be favourable to everyone, because what's going to happen here is whatever decision you make, there's a percentage of people that aren't going to like it, and you kind of, I hate to say it, to be a good leader, you have to make unpopular decisions. So someone I'm going to give credit to is actually the Premier of New South Wales, and it's Chris Minns. I'm not traditionally a conservative, I'm not traditionally a left-wing or Labor voter or someone that would probably sway that way, but like, credit's due where it's due. Like, this program he brought out, which is called Transport Orientated Development, will definitely help. So it's basically in the key pockets of Sydney, so it's particularly between the inner west and Parramatta. High density is going to be basically what's actually already been permitted there in some of the areas, not all, but that's going to increase density, increase dwelling, so that will definitely help. Look, locals aren't going to like it, but when we've got a crisis this bad, some things like this are going to have to be done, and I just say suck it up, because look, I don't like high rises being built in my backyard either, but I prefer someone to be living in a home than on the street just at the end of the day. So that's my personal opinion on it. This also includes some stations in the Central Coast, Newcastle and the Wollongong actual council regions, and actually I should say Lake Macquarie as well. Only a couple, but it will help there too. So I'll give you credit there, Mr. Chris Minns. You're at least trying to take some action, so credit's due where it's due. There is few issues though, and look, I cannot stand this present government. They have no idea what they're doing. You shouldn't be able to run a country if you've never run a business before, because you don't know how to run anything. You shouldn't be able to be a lifelong bureaucrat or a lifelong person in the unions, because you don't know how business runs either. You should have to have a real job and at least have some idea how to run a balance sheet. But there's things like this, terrible disincentives, how the new ute tax / SUV tax will actually impact Aussies. So what they did, this is in early 24, what they did was they increased taxes on large vehicles. And I asked people a very simple question. Yes, some people may say it's not that much. Why does it affect people? Any disincentive is going to naturally move people out of doing that. So I don't care whether it's $20 a year, or it's 20 grand a year. I don't care. Look, this is going to be more than that. It's probably going to be a couple of $100 to $1,000 probably a year, something like that. But naturally speaking, you want to incentivize people who can help the crisis. So I've asked people before, what's the biggest crisis? Nearly everyone says the housing crisis or cost of living. That's nearly everyone. The second thing I asked them then is, who solves that crisis? It's tradies and transport workers. So that's heavy vehicles. No one but heavy vehicles, right? And then I asked them, okay, and then what vehicles do they use? They use trucks and utes. But we're going to disincentivize that. So how does that even make sense? So that's another thing that's actually going on, which really pisses me off. But, the government does what they do. And, I don't understand how people still fall for this nonsense. Don't vote for these guys. They're terrible. I don't mean necessarily all state governments, but the federal government has done an awful job, awful job at the two main things, the housing crisis and the cost of living crisis. And this is one of the policies that's causing that. This is actually even worse in some locations. So I know I've mentioned federal government, so I'm actually going to go to state government now. So this is just an article off, I think it's the ABC from memory. I can't actually remember where I got off. It is the ABC actually. And where this comes from is Victorian government accused of unfair land taxes, couple slugged for granny flat housing elderly mother. So this couple decided, because the mother couldn't afford to live in her home, to slug this couple land tax because they were housing their mother in it. How does that even make sense? So they're actually helping the housing crisis, but the government says, we fucked up our economy so bad because we couldn't run a sausage sizzle, so we're just going to tax you because we don't know what we're doing, we need to recoup funds. That is not what you do. And the crazy thing about this is, I'm not mentioning this couple, but there are literally people in states like this, and it's the same as like California and the United States, who will still vote for the same party despite how bad it's got. If you've had someone in charge for any longer than 5 years and things have got worse, They have no excuses to say anything. I actually would even go as far as saying, even if a government has had charge of 2 years and things have not got better, it is 100% their fault. You cannot say we inherited this budget, it is the previous party's fault or anything like that. Okay, some governments that are should I say centre left of the line or centre right have done good jobs either side of the line, but this Victorian government has done a terrible job, and no one can doubt that. And the people who vote for this, you are the problem for things like this, because you are not considering what has happened. When a government comes into power, you inherit a budget and you know most of what's being gone. It's actually published. Sure, there might be a few expenses, but you can't use that excuse for any longer than 2 years. You have the power to change it and at least make it better. So things like this is appalling. You're actually... You should, in my opinion, if it was up to me, I think they should sue the state government for doing a bad job, because you swear to oath to actually act in the best interest of the people, and that's not doing this. This is actually, in my opinion, Orwellian power, and this is actual theft of money for this poor family here. So this is what I mean by terrible governance. The other thing I'd like to say is as well, the government likes to say, and they'll continue to say this, that we've solved the inflation crisis, because our inflation has dropped to 2.8% or under 3% or whatever it is, around 2.5 to 3%, right? Now, let's be honest about this. What the media, and I don't know how the media doesn't press them about this, and I wish someone like me or someone who actually looked at the true statistics of it would, but inflation is made up of two key things, and one is tradables inflation, the other is non-tradables inflation. So the easiest way to describe this is tradables inflation is inflation that is influenced by the international economy or other nations around the world. So it's basically international inflation. That's the easiest way to describe it, because it is affected by global currencies, is affected by global trade, it's affected by global prices of other things, right? Non-tradables inflation is basically domestic inflation, right? Easiest way to describe it. So if you look at the graph here, and this is off the ABS, so I'm not making anything up, you will see here, tradables inflation, right, is literally under 1% at the moment. And this was taken in the September quarter, mind you. So it's probably even better here. I took this screenshot a little while ago just to demonstrate how bullshit what they're talking about is going on. And you'll see longer term, actually, for the most part, the Australian actual inflation is actually, non-tradable inflation has actually been above the tradables inflation. So who solves the inflation crisis? More so, it's the international community. Our inherent inflation is over 4%, roughly still. Right, so it's not our government claiming that they've solved it. It's actually the internationals that have done the better job. So this is what the news should focus on. Like, they need to press them on these sorts of things. Like, they must be like, well, obviously the ABC is funded by the actual government, but like these other actual media corporations, they need to press them on these sorts of things, because this is the truth of where inflation's at in our Australian economy. I wish it was the other way around. I wish we had non-tradables at where the tradables is, and then the tradables was they swap places. Tradables is high, because that would mean our government's doing better than the average. But the truth is they're doing significantly worse. But no one asks them this question, and no one presses them on this, and that's what we should be pressing them on. Anyway, let's get into probably one of the most frustrating things of this whole thing, and I cannot emphasize how pissed off this makes me, but we have a mass immigration crisis in Australia, in a housing crisis. We have a mass immigration for no absolute reason. Now look, I'm from an immigrant background, both of my parents. So my father is a Vietnamese immigrant. He came over legally, and he came over originally after waiting a few years in line to actually get into Australia, right? There's no fast visa approvals, none of that at all. And he waited his time, eventually got in, and all was good and well, right? But at the moment, we have a housing crisis. We're about 250,000 dwellings short, and we've just brought in close to 600,000 people from overseas. And we are dwelling short, and we're a long way short of our housing targets, and then we do that. Do you think that's a good idea? What's even worse is when you look at like where the actual trend's going, and this is just off Matusik with Treasury and actual ABS statistics, so I'm not making this up either. If you look at the trend line from 1984 to where we are today, look at that trend. Now, sure, it's gone up, and sure, the government might say they're going to drop it a little bit in recent years. Still, that's not enough. It needs to be like 50 to 100,000, this immigration number. It needs to be like quartered or a fifth of what it is. But anyway, this is where it's going. It's actually pretty scary, like for the Australian public. It's not very good for us. So, look, this is where we're going. I cannot believe I even have to say this because, like, people do not press them on these issues. I don't know how people vote for governments that continue to do this. And it's not even, I'm telling you right now, it's not even just the Labor Party or the Greens. It's also, it's not all of them, but it's some parts of the Liberal Party as well are continuing to try to do this. I can't, it's not popular with everyone, but the last person I can think who tried to get this under wraps was Tony Abbott. It's the last one I can think of who really tried to get this under wraps. But anyway, that's where we're going. And it's not really a good thing. So it's actually most of what they're doing, aside from what I mentioned with someone like Chris Minns, has been just this ridiculous mass immigration, stupid policy thing going down. So hopefully some more of these premiers, and hopefully we can get a change of government to actually start to fix this in the long term, because it's not going in the right direction, people. We really need to fix this thing in the large part of what's going on. A big question that I think everyone would ask after this whole video, and I'm sorry it might sound a little bit negative, I don't mean it to, I just mean it to be honest, is when will this crisis end? And it's a really difficult thing for me to go through because I want this to end immediately. Look, to be honest, all the shit, like, even though I know I said Chris Minns has had a good policy in terms of trying to change it, he shouldn't have to do that because of what's been going on in the past. Like, that is a basically band-aid fix to what should have been done in the first place. That's the issue I have. But the first things first, what we need to do is we need to limit immigration completely limit it, because if we don't, what's going to happen is it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And a good example of what we can do is something similar to Switzerland. So Switzerland has, for people that don't know, they are a part of Schengen, but they're not a part of Euro, so they don't have to abide by and bow down to these ridiculous, pro-immigration, just let everyone in no matter who they are, policies, no matter if we can house them or not, like Germany and France did in that immigrant crisis in the Iraqi-Syrian war. Like, they brought in 2 million immigrants, and there's slums in the outsides of cities now and just crime everywhere. I actually feel sorry for them, some of them as well, because a lot of them actually have came in wanting to do the right things, but there's just no houses to house them, and you can't have 15 people living in a 30-meter squared unit. You just can't have that. So Switzerland has very strict immigration, and you'll see just here alone, property prices actually since 2002 for over 20 years haven't done anything over really drastically 10%. It's been pretty consistent and stable, and the reason for that is because they've got fairly even demand and supply. So sure, it's gone up a little bit and it's grown pretty well, but it's not done like Australia. It's probably done half of what Australia's done, so it's affordable for their population because they earn actually higher income than Australia. So that's something we can do. Look, another thing we need to do is we need to remove unqualified politicians who have never run a business before. So a lot of these guys have either gone through the unions, gone through the Greens, just gone through university, done an arts degree, or done something that has no has no economical sense and just doesn't make sense on how to run a business. And they do things like this. Let's freeze rents. And in this article, They actually go through why freezing rents could make more people homeless, and I'll tell you the reason why that is. Now, if we have a landlord, right, who can no longer afford their mortgage, and sure, some people might argue that a house shouldn't be an investment vehicle. I disagree, but it's a different argument you had on a different day. But the reality of it is that 30% of people were still renting pre-1970s, between 1950 and 1970, before houses went up in value. So the reason for that is you're going to have people that first move out of home. You're going to have people on contracts like locum doctors, for example. You have overseas residents. You'll have people traveling here. You'll have people that just don't want to buy a house and just prefer to rent and like traveling a lot. So a percentage of people are always going to be doing that regardless of what happens. And the issue with that is you can try to limit the market and limit people being in the market and making it unaffordable for landlords, but then they sell and you've got the same amount of demand for rentals but less supply, so prices have to go up. So the opposite actually needs to happen, where you have to promote landlords buying homes and creating dwellings so there's higher supply and the demand to supply ratio goes down, so prices can't go up so much. So this guy in the Greens never run a business in his life before, just goes screaming on the Q&A and all those rubbish television shows and all that crap, and with the unions and all that. Never run a business before, mind you. So I don't know how you even take a word of sense out of him, but he goes on saying things like this without actually explaining how this is going to work and without any economical sense. So we need to get all of these guys out of Parliament because they don't know what they're talking about. The sad thing is, the most educated areas in the country vote for these idiotic politicians, these Teals and Greens, people who don't know what they're talking about. I'm not having a go at the Labor Party, not every Green, but a lot of them do not know what they're talking about and have never run a business in their life, but they're in charge of millions of dollars and billions of dollars of taxpayer money. Riddle me that, how that even works. So that's another thing we need to do here. Another thing, we need to promote supply and incentivise tradesmen. I know the Labor government recently announced, and this isn't state, I'm not having about the state governments at all, because some actually are doing some policies that aren't too bad, but half of all people go to uni, but tradies are happier. Now, I saw something of them saying we want 80% or more recently. This was in, I think, September or October in 2024, with them saying they want roughly 80% or more of people to go to uni. Now, we don't need more people in the talking industry. We don't need more people in the doing industry. We don't need more people talking about their feelings, not doing anything, and just being government bureaucrats or oversupplying psychologist centres or anything like that, where we've got so many, we're so oversupplied in the amount of graduates in these degrees. We don't need any more PE teachers. We need more maths teachers, more science teachers, more economics teachers. We need people, engineers. We need tradesmen, especially. Realistically, probably 30 to 40% of the country needs to be tradesmen to get the things in the ground that we need to build the infrastructure, to maintain it, to maintain just everyday life. We don't need like 80% of people to go to uni, and even if it was 80% and let's say everyone else was a tradie, which wouldn't be true, 20% is roughly half of what the tradies we need. So these are just stupid, idiotic policies, and we need to get rid of these politicians immediately who incentivize this absolute nonsense, because it's just insanity. Like, I don't understand how people vote for this crap. It is so bad. Another thing we need to do is incentivize domestic investment, not like this. So this is just from Peter Switzer Financial. I don't mind him, don't agree with everything he says, but he definitely has a point here. New South Wales joins Labor's tax assault on the successful. So this is raising land tax. I don't agree with it at all, because if you're raising land tax, are you going to also cut, are you going to start to cut council rates? Are you going to do any of that? Are you going to incentivise things in the other way? They don't do that. It goes up higher than inflation. They don't even index it. It should be indexed to what everything else is done if you want to incentivise it. That makes sense. Index it to GDP. Sure, you make more land tax, but people making more money, so they're the same off. It should be probably a little bit less, because statistically speaking, when taxes drop, more income comes in because people spend more money, then it goes through GST. That's statistically proven throughout the world, but a lot of governments do not do that. Now, I know I promoted what Chris Minns said previously, but this is one thing that shouldn't have been done. So anyway, I will call them out for what needs to be called out on. Second of all, we need big changes in policy or government. It does not help when you have approval ratings like this. Guardian Essential, Albanese approval ratings drops to new low amid Dutton signs on losing hand with nuclear. Now, look, again, like, you don't get me wrong, you want to you do want, policy that does favour the majority of Australians, I agree. But when you have an approval rating that's below 30%, so a primary vote of below 30%, so I think he won the one with a primary vote of something like 33% or something like that. Now it's below 30. That means less than a third of Australians actually want you as their Prime Minister, because we have a two-party preferred system, right? So that means you are catering to less than a third of Australians, and if that is the non-contributing Australians, so that is the people who are on dole payments, and I don't mean people from very disadvantaged backgrounds who can't help it, like abusive households or, from a very bad situation. I mean people that are taking the piss, or these greenie people, for example, that don't work, block traffic in streets and all that crap. If you're catering to them, the other 67 plus, or 70, in this case 70% of the population, you are not actually catering for, and that is the majority. That is who you actually need to cater for, not the small minority who is screaming about it, okay? So let's just be real here. We need politicians, and it might sound bad, but the reason populist politicians are doing very well at the moment is because they're catering for the majority, and that's what we need in government at the moment. That will help the crisis. It won't help this nonsense that we got going on at the moment. Finally, let's just be honest. How long this will take to fix? Now, how long the housing crisis will take to fix, really, there's a couple of things that we actually need to go through here. So first of all, we would need all the perfect policies and incentives to happen immediately. Second of all, we've presently got 250 to 300,000 plus dwellings short at the moment. Now, that number might fluctuate depending on the graph, or report you read, pardon me, but that's the true number we've got. Look, the present government alone is already behind on their originally forecasted target. So they said 1.25 million homes in the next 5 years, right? 1.2 million homes. Now, alone, and this was in July, and they're actually by now worse off than this. They were already forecasted to be 250,000 homes short of that. So that's 250,000 dwellings, right, short already. And on top of that, they've brought in mass immigration. They need to cut that immigration number to literally like 50 to 100,000 at absolute maximum. Like even lower would be better, but I understand we do need a little bit of it, definitely. But we need to cut that number right down. But they're bringing in like 500,000 plus immigrants a year, and that's just throwing fuel on the fire. So if we're already short by 260,000 homes, right, in that forecast, and already 250,000, and I'm taking a low number, minimum homes short, and the number's worse than that. That's 500,000 homes. Now, if you're bringing in 600,000 immigrants, or let's even call it 500,000 immigrants, and it's 2.2 per household, you need more than 200,000 homes just to house them. So you're really short 700,000, and year after year after year, that only gets worse. That number's going to hit 1 million soon. And it's just ridiculous. So we need really to really decide on what we're doing for the best future for our country. But if all decisions are, look, I always think optimism is good. So I'm going to just assume the best in the Australian people, and they're going to vote the way they should and and really care about others. I'm going to assume at best 2 to 3 years from today, no matter how unpopular, that all the decisions that need to be made are made. I'm just going to pray to God that the politicians are going to make the unpopular decisions, and they're going to do the best thing for the country, because that's what we need. Now, look, today's episode was a little bit different, but at the end of the day, I do invest in property, and I do hope everyone's, enjoyed this show. And if you disagree with me, that's okay. I think freedom of speech, whether you agree or whether how much you disagree with me or agree with me, is true in nature, that you're truly free to say whatever you want. So feel free to comment that below. I don't have any issues with that. I'm more than happy to answer it in my point of view. As long as you're respectful, that's great. But for those looking to get in the market, please subscribe to the channel, or even if you're not and you enjoy this video, please subscribe. And if you're looking to get in the market, please reach out to me either via my contact details below or booking a consult. All of those details can be found in the description. If you're really serious about getting ahead and building a huge portfolio, reach out to me, and also join up to Premier Properties. That is properties with a total return of 13% or more. That is your 30-year capital growth via CoreLogic RP data, plus your immediate gross rental yield. Now, what I seek to achieve here is a higher capital growth component, usually around 9% of that total return, because over the long term, capital growth stays stagnant while rental yield slides down. And it's because capital growth in the best suburbs will do 7 to 10%. You can generally only do 3 to 4 over the long term. So exponentially year after year after year, capital growth outdoes further and further and further rental yield. So it slides down over time, but that's what you want, because rental yield is percentage of the asset value, and your IRR will be higher. Internal rate of return will be significantly higher. So that's the reason I do that. Anyway, thanks again, and I hope everyone enjoyed the channel. Thanks, guys.